Early in my mission in Ohio, I came across a pamphlet in one of my apartments that was essentially a 30-point challenge to detractors of the Book of Mormon, inviting them to try to come up with something similar. At the time, when I read it, each point seemed like a pretty solid evidence for the veracity of the Book of Mormon. However, when one closely examines each point beyond a superficial consideration, this challenge really isn't as compelling. Welcome, friends, enemies, and everyone in between, to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am, of course, the Masked Mormon. I am a Mormon who used to believe that the Book of Mormon told the history of a people who used to live in the ancient Americas. Then, after a pretty intense faith crisis, I realized that the Book of Mormon was the product of the creative mind of Joseph Smith in the early 19th century. The Book of Mormon challenge was popularized by Hugh Nibley. The challenge was often presented to his students as they studied the Book of Mormon in his classes. This challenge is to invite detractors of the Book of Mormon to try their hand at writing a similar work, with the idea being that it would be so difficult that it could only be the result of divine help. But today we're going to examine the first 15 points of this 30-point challenge. I will then cover the rest of the points in the next video. But we are going to briefly examine how compelling each of these points are and how well they support the divine claims of the Book of Mormon. So, let's get into it. So, reading from the pamphlet, it says, "If one scoffs at the missionary's explanation of the Book of Mormon, he is in so many words claiming it to be false, that it is a deceiving fraud formulated through the efforts and talents of a common man. What is produced by one man can always be duplicated by another. The challenge that the Book of Mormon makes to the world is that of duplication. Because the book complies with every one of our following conditions, in order to produce a similar record, one must comply with the same conditions. Here is the challenge. Can you accept it?" So the first point that Nibley brings up is to, quote, "write a history of ancient Tibet covering a period from 600 BC to 450 AD. Why ancient Tibet? Because you know no more about Tibet than Joseph Smith or anyone else knew about ancient America." Okay, well, that's actually kind of irrelevant. Joseph Smith wrote about what he knew. He had, growing up, been hearing stories about the Native Americans and how they were a lost tribe of Israel. The Mound Builder myth was a widely known conception of where the Native Americans came from. Okay. The second point, you are 23 years of age. Again, this is irrelevant. Many people have published books they wrote when they were young. Mary Shelley was a teenager when she wrote Frankenstein. Being young really has no bearing on whether you can or can't write a book. The third point, you have had no more than 3 years of formal school education and have spent your life in backwoods farming communities. Okay, well, Abraham Lincoln also had very little formal schooling, roughly a year. But he did a lot of self-education, and he became president of the United States. Joseph had family members that were school teachers. He was also an avid reader. He was also a very talented storyteller. Additionally, Muhammad was barely literate when he produced the Quran. Point 4, your history must be written on the basis of what you know now. There was no library that held information for Joseph Smith. You must use none. There is to be no research of any kind. Again, Joseph did write what he knew. He incorporated stories that were common in the zeitgeist at the time. Joseph was a fan of fiction, of crime stories, the Captain Kidd stories. He also read the Bible extensively and attended sermons from preachers throughout the area that he lived in. Point 5. Your history must be 531 pages and over 300,000 words in length. Okay? That's kind of an arbitrary value. The Lord of the Rings has about 500,000 words. The Quran is longer than the Book of Mormon and is considered a work of high literary quality. Okay? Let's go on to point 6 then. Other than a few grammatical corrections, you must have no changes in the text. The first edition, as you dictated to your secretary, must stand forever. Now, this has been shown to be false. There are several doctrinal changes that were corrected after the first publishing of the Book of Mormon. These include changing the nature of God to incorporate Joseph Smith's changing theology. But even on a basic level, thousands of corrections were made to the book even after its first publishing run. Point 7 says, this record is to contain the history of 2 distinct and separate nations, along with histories of different contemporary nations or groups of people. Okay? Every story needs some conflict or antagonist in order to be interesting. The Mound Builder myth was the racist belief that the dark-skinned Native Americans couldn't have built the civilization that the white settlers came upon. So, there must have been a superior white race that existed before and that was eventually destroyed by the dark-skinned people. This belief all but vanished from the collective consciousness, except for Mormon belief. This belief would have vanished centuries ago, but is preserved in Mormonism via the Book of Mormon. Point 8. You must describe their religious, economic, political, and social cultures and institutions. Cover every phrase of their society, including the names of their coins. Joseph was a very talented storyteller. His mother told about his ability to regale his family with stories. Quote, during our evening conversations, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, their mode of traveling, and the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings, with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. End of quote. But there are also numerous works of fiction where the author describes in great detail the social life and political structures of imaginary cultures. Point 9 says, change your style of writing many times. Many ancient authors contributed to the Book of Mormon, each with his own style. This isn't really unique. Novelists often change their writing style within a book. This can change depending on the perspective of the character that is being narrated, the tone that is needed for a specific scene, or to highlight specific themes or plot points. They will adapt their style to meet the narrative needs of the story. But it can also be argued that many of the style changes that occur in the Book of Mormon are when there is extensive quoting of the King James Bible. Okay, let's move on to point 10. Weave into your history the religion of Jesus Christ and the pattern of Christian living. Joseph was very familiar with the Bible, including the New Testament. Many New Testament passages are incorporated into the book. The theology in the book is very similar to Methodism. It also addresses theological issues that were important in Joseph Smith's time. All right, moving on to point 11. You must claim that your smooth narrative is not fiction with moral value, but true and a sacred history. So, what's more likely? A lost civilization with no evidence of ever having existed, who left a record in a way that has never been done before, or that Joseph lied? Muhammad claimed that the Quran was dictated to him by an angel. Should we believe this claim without proof as well? Point 12. You must include in your book 54 chapters dealing with wars, 21 historical chapters, 55 chapters on visions and prophecies. Remember, when you begin to write visions and prophecies, you must have your record agree meticulously with the Bible. You must write 71 chapters on doctrine and exhortation, and you must check every statement with the scriptures, or you will be proven a fraud. You must write 21 chapters on the ministry of Christ, and everything you claim he said and every testimony you write in the book about him must agree absolutely with the New Testament. Okay, well, this is irrelevant. Wars and conflict in a story are interesting and can draw in a reader. The agreement with the Bible is simply because passages are lifted directly from the Bible. The ministry of Jesus that's told in the Book of Mormon is largely just a retelling of New Testament stories. This is the same reason why what's in the Book of Mormon will agree with the New Testament. The Book of Mormon may agree with Protestant Christianity, but it really kind of fails to agree with Old Testament Judaism. Moving on to point 13. Many of the facts, claims, ideas, and statements given as absolute truth in your writing must be entirely inconsistent with the prevailing beliefs of the world. Some of these worldly beliefs must be directly opposed to your claims. This is actually the opposite of what happened. We don't recognize the mound builder myth now, or the lost tribes of Israel being scattered among the nations of the earth. These were very common beliefs held by a large segment of the population at the time. Moving on to point 14. Included in your narrations will be authentic modes of travel, whether or not those ancient people used fire, descriptions of their clothing, crops, mourning customs, and types of government. You must invent about 280 new names that will stand up under scrutiny through the years as to their proper application and derivation. So it's known now that horses didn't exist in the Americas at the time. Neither did wheeled vehicles like chariots. The plants described in the Book of Mormon don't match what existed in the Americas at the time. There should be cacao, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, squash, and avocados. Just because Joseph described a democracy in the Book of Mormon doesn't mean that that form of government existed in pre-Columbian America. Any imaginative person could have come up with names as needed as their narrative progressed. Now moving on to the last point that we're going to cover in today's video, point 15. You will have to properly use figures of speech, similes, metaphors, narrations, exposition, descriptions, oratory, epic, lyric, and parables. What does this even mean? These are all elements in storytelling or oration, or any other literary work. Those are the first 15 points of Nibley's Book of Mormon challenge. And so far, they aren't really holding up to scrutiny. Maybe the next 15 will? But what are your thoughts? Did you ever read this challenge? Did you find it compelling? Let me know down in the comments. And if you like what I do, please press the like button and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.